Hello. I think I've started. I've shortened the title of this presentation a little bit to engagement and collaboration with data. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the background to documentation data, and then give a few examples of where things are going wrong. And then I'm going to do a case study which talks about some work that has been done at the National Archives in the UK to try and bridge this gap of knowledge. Okay, my clicker isn't working. Oh, there it is. Okay. So where I'm going to start is with early public documentation. So this is a form on the screen of a type of public documentation that was sent out by a guy called James Salter, who started the Saltero's Coffee House in the 17th century, which went all the way through the 18th century as well. And the catalogue was designed to attract the curiosity of people and get them into the coffee house to spend money. And the objects it donatized were donated by people like Hans Sloane, who Salter was previously employee of, and had patrons like Isaac Newton. And you can see by the slide that there's a variety of things that Saltero's put on display. There's about sort of 20 pages of these curious items. And you can see at 15, I wanted you to note an Indian pipe of peace called by the natives a calumet. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, I think my clicker is still not working. Thank you. So has it gone on? I think it's gone on 2. I'm going to try and go back. It's the correct one. Okay, so about 40 years ago, in the 1980s, the UK government decided that larger museums needed to have a proper record of their collections. And this prompted an investment in database technology, and administrative teams were brought in to transfer existing card files that had been built up over time by curators and registration books, and they transferred these into a database and constructed new data models to take this type of data. So it was very much based on the type of data that was already being noted in a sort of structured form, but on paper. And this took a significant effort to establish this type of database, but there were some quite big flaws. The objective was not scholarly, it was coming from the government, and it was administrative, it was about auditing. So the data was transferred without curatorial supervision. And a lot of the data on these cards, which were static file cards, were out of date and contained a particular type of language and style. So knowledge about collections changes over time, and the purposes to which that documentation is used also changes over time, and the way we think about documentation changes over time. So, for example, one of the big examples is the publication of documentation data to the web. However, this approach used in these early systems informed subsequent documentation standards, and actually, although it's 40 years ago, similar techniques are still used today. Database systems were actually developed in the 1960s by someone called Charles Bachman, a commercial data processing engineer. Before Bachman's innovation, only large companies could afford to engineer their own data management systems. So one of the biggest impediments to commercial adoption of computers initially was the lack of a ready-made off-the-shelf data system that brought together all the elements needed to store and retrieve and administer data for company supply chains and financial controls. The key thing is that Most of the databases that we use today and the common databases that we're using in cultural heritage and humanities projects are based on exactly the same design. So the objective is not to explain material objects. So Bachmann wasn't interested in explaining history and human behavior. It was all about the efficiency of business processing. And you can see a picture that he did here about how he can put things into pigeonholes and retrieve them at an incredible rate. But this has an impact because it means that you have to store data in a particular form and structure, which is limiting. So databases have no semantics in the data themselves. So we put on front ends onto databases, but intrinsically, the data inside the database has no data itself. And this has a massive impact when you start publishing open data. Because of their lack of semantics, they can't deal with complexity. They can't deal with historical complexity. You can't easily expand the categories of knowledge easily because they're relatively fixed data models. Once you've got one in place, then they tend to need to be maintained in the same state. Otherwise, there's a lot of work necessary to change the front ends. And the static nature of this type of arrangement means that there's a lot of legacy information that builds up, a lot of legacy information, and ultimately a lot of some bias as well. So when we publish this data out onto the web, it changes the nature of the purpose and aims of that data. But also it does something else. It promotes that data from an administrative index to a primary source of information. And therefore, there's a lot more responsibility in understanding the impact and the content of that data. Oops. So in essence, digital database systems strip away conceptual reference. Conceptual reference isn't just about the CIDOC CRM. It was a term used well before then. And conceptual reference means that wider social and historical context in which the objects were created and existed provides that conceptual reference. And that concept has been at the core of curatorial knowledge for a long time. If there's no curator to fill the gaps when the data is published, it starts to become not simply an index or a finding aid, but as I said, a primary source of information. So ultimately, we're divorcing this information from its context and stripping it down and then publishing it out. And there's an impact to that. Internally in our organizations, we have a lot of knowledge. We are what's called knowledge institutions. But in fact, it's fragmented across many different repositories in many different internal and external locations. The number one structured data tool is the spreadsheet, simply because, as a personal tool, it allows subject experts to add as many columns and rows as they like. The administrative systems create a functional process which is not as well aligned as it could be to other knowledge activities. So working overheads are created because of this gap. With greater alignment, there could be an effective way of providing a richer type of documentation that is directly aligned with the knowledge process of the institution for use both internally and externally, removing the separation and overlap and producing a much more dynamic environment. So I wanted to bring in some examples of the static nature of data, and I'm going to start with a public database or a public information system, Wikipedia. So I noticed quite recently that the term peace pipe had been discontinued. It says the peace pipe is a colonial misnomer for a ceremonial pipe. The term peace pipe is used quite widely across museums. And their image has been shaped, the role of these pipes has been shaped by Western perspectives. And in fact, these pipes had many other uses, although those uses are hard to discover through museum collection systems. You can see that the other references to peace pipe on this page include a trophy. The term has a long legacy which is politically charged and denotes a particular colonial perspective, given the degree of violence that occurred in the past. The trophy, in fact, if you just, can I click on one more? Should bring up this. So when you actually click the link to the trophy, it says the schools agreed to change the trophy after conversations with members of the American Indian community. Taking into consideration the spiritual symbolism of the ceremonial pipe to the American Indian community, as well as the push to remove inappropriate American Indian nicknames and symbols. So Wikipedia has been and is quite a dynamic environment, and it's changed the text in some of these entries. When you move to Wikidata, which is the structured data version of Wikipedia, the peace pipe legacy lives on. It has a picture which has a label, peace pipe, which comes from the Peabody Museum at Harvard. Its source is from 1907, Nuttall's Encyclopedia. But if you consult another historian of the time, Roland Dunbars, who was the director of Mississippi Archives and a member of the American Historical Society, his entry in the Encyclopedia of Mississippi History says, Calumet means a pipe. It is a Norman word derived from Chalameux, which is the name of a rustic pipe or musical instrument used among the shepherds at their rural feasts and dances. And the name of Calumet was first applied to this Indian pipe by the early Norman French settlers of Canada, and it has since retained its name. There are many examples on collection online systems of the Calumet peace pipe. A lot of these are probably still close to the original card records. Peace pipe and Calumet are terms which seem to be universal, and Wikidata commonly abstracts from published museum data. Here's another example from the National Museum of the American Indian, and actually their digital record is exactly the same as the one that came from the original source, the Army Medical Museum, which had its original building demolished in 1969, so I assume that the card came over about that time. And in the Smithsonian, this record has changed very little since its digitization. It's almost an exact copy of that original card. And that card probably was created even earlier than that. If you go to the US the federal government National Park Service, it says, although many people associate Native American pipes with the term peace pipe, this is a misnomer. Again, talking about the misnomer of this name. Early American settlers and soldiers took the note that the pipe was being smoked at treaty signings, resulting in their misunderstanding of the pipe as something done only to symbolize peace. So again, this is a correction on a website that hasn't been corrected on data sites from cultural heritage. And on the Peabody Museum's website, they've actually put in a notice that you have to accept before entering the site. So they say that collection records may contain language reflecting past collection practices and methods of analysis that is no longer acceptable. So they're actually pointing out the problem that potentially there is offensive and discriminatory language, although they haven't actually taken the site down. So you have to press this button. But is it just about the language, but is it also about missing context? So these are the two big issues, the language that we're using and the things that we're omitting from those data records. So I wanted to touch on a case study that's happening at the National Archives with the Head of Conservation and Treatment Development, Sonia Scholl. And they've just taken on an instance of ResearchSpace, of which I headed up. And National Archives has basically replaced their current collection care system with ResearchSpace, which was developed through the Andrew Mellon Foundation, through funding from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And they're collaborating with a social enterprise, Kartography, which is committed to developing contextual data systems to allow computer-readable information to express wider contexts, incorporate greater diversity of information, address the history and knowledge of different communities, and promote equality of information content. The work with cartography will address the issues of selection and priority of archival records in terms of their wider significance and relevance to community groups. And the adoption of ResearchSpace automatically provides the means for a more inclusive data equality and content policy for the National Archives. So ResearchSpace is, as I said, an Andrew Mellon Foundation funded project at the British Museum. It's a new type of contextualizing knowledge system which promotes collaborative, interdisciplinary research, allowing people to grow knowledge that relates to processes, history, and material culture. It works exclusively with linked data. It's natively linked data database or knowledge base, and uses ontologies, but most effectively with the one that we've developed through CIDOC, which is the CIDOC CRM, which provides that context that I was talking about. It's open source and freely available. And hopefully all of this work at the National Archives will also become available to other organisations. So the Mellon Foundation's objectives initially, so this is a project that wasn't initiated by an organisation, it was initiated by the Mellon, who had particular objectives. And the objectives were basically that they wanted a system that could be used to host any number of applications and be hosted inside a single museum or remotely, that it should impose no strict requirements on data models, and it should permit models to be revised, so dynamically changed over time with minimal effort, with minimal cost, with minimal overhead. And it should not force projects into a common mould. Every effort would be made to preserve the scholarly uniqueness of each project. And this has been transferred into an institutional system, these types of principles. So it would enable collaboration with any other implementation, whether or not hosted on the same server, at the same institution, or on the same continent. Researchers or knowledge workers working in a particular department could pursue their work in whatever new directions that may emerge. And these are basically the objectives that have been delivered by the project. The National Archives strategy is one of practitioner-researcher. So the conservators and scientists work together, and they mix and they integrate and exchange knowledge between the two parts of the department, and they convert practice into research, and they convert research into practice. And therefore, that's why they wanted a system that would support this type of dynamism. They want to augment collection records. So they have a lot of information, history as well as technical, scientific information about objects. So they want to augment the National Archive collection records with additional information derived from their research. They want to add a significance and relevance assessment for their objects. So they develop a method for how they prioritize the conservation of particular objects that includes an analysis of their historical context. They obviously want to enhance the quality of conservation documentation so that it is qualitatively of a high qualitative level to support research. And they want to incorporate research into practical techniques and methods. So, as I say, this exchange of information between the two parts of the department. And this is achieved by moving from a traditional documentation to a knowledge system. And ultimately, being able to create this richer, more dynamic, more connected environment means that it can be then opened up to collaborators and local and regional organisations to start up a knowledge network. So the implementation of research in the National Archives was in October last year. There was a very short space of time to implement it. Because ResearchSpace is a dynamic model and it's quite flexible, and because the logic and the meaning is embedded in data, not in the interfaces, not in the user interfaces, it can be used to rapidly create new applications. And as such, the transfer of the TNA's old system to a completely new one, a new custom system, took approximately 3 months, including integration with the National Archives discovery system. And this gives you an idea of the strategy, the architecture, the strategy that we're sort of after, or then the National Archives is looking to implement. The documentation side, although augmented on the left-hand side, connects up to this knowledge base, which looks at methods, techniques, significance criteria, observations, ad hoc observations. There's information that applies to types of objects, but there's also more qualitative information that applies to particular specialist items. And this knowledge base ties into the documentation system. So instead of having links to, for example, vocabularies, it actually links to a knowledge base. And this knowledge base changes over time. And as it changes over time, those changes are registered within the day-to-day work of the conservationists, and therefore they can start to ask more interesting questions. So the system will be able to answer questions about the development of methods and techniques over time to understand changes in conservation approaches. It will incorporate significance and relevance assessments. It will enrich the record, as I said before, and allow the TNA to understand how it approaches and prioritizes conservation across the collection. This knowledge is then used to establish those partnerships on the right-hand side, so public interfaces and dissemination, but also interactive participatory collaborations as well. The point is that once knowledge generation processes are aligned and represent the richness of the work in the organization, it then becomes an accessible tool for external engagement and external participation. So some of the things that Cartography has done as part of this project of implementing ResearchSpace is a connection to the discovery system. So the conservators and scientists can have their own interface going into the API of the TNA discovery system and importing information from that into their projects on an ad hoc basis. There's no big bang. And as that data becomes imported, it's converted into that semantic dynamic format automatically, and therefore is integrated into the database from a traditional legacy database that Discovery is. It'll enable them to do more precise work. So it has mechanisms for being able to pick out particular features, physical features on the objects, and to mark them out as surrogates, which can then have more detailed analysis and treatment and assessment information connected to them. So on their previous system, it's much more general. On this system, it conforms to a more scientific way of doing things, which is applied to both conservators and to scientists. So it becomes less of an administrative system and much more of a scientific and exploratory system. It enables them also to embed data. So data that's created within the system can be dragged into a document, and that document is actually a visualization of data. So you can actually click on the visualizations and on the right-hand side see the data for that. And this becomes an interactive tool as well, bringing in other parts of the system into a sort of document that is a database in its own right, and enables you to read the narratives alongside the data that's been collected about certain things. It has very semantically rich search facilities. So this is an example of one that filters by relationships within the system. And again, you can, as you're going along, see the data that's connected to the things that you find. If we go to the next one. I think we might have skipped one. No, oh, no, we haven't. Sorry. If you go back, if you go forward again. We're introducing, I talked about significance and relevance. So we've introduced a new extension to the CIDOC CRM, which we'll be presenting to the CIDOC CRM special interest group fairly soon, which is about influence, a lightweight type of causation. So influence is measured in this context in terms of the effect it has on groups or individuals as a result of both structural or agental factors. There's an interconnection between phenomenon at the level of lived experience and that of wider societal dynamics. So this is about introducing both social, environmental, individual, and inner influence into the process of documentation. So we can start making connections which are about this type of multi-causal phenomena. The conservators and scientists also will be able to start visually modeling. So as I said, it's a dynamic visual environment, and the curators, the conservators can start modeling using a visual tool. So this is an authoring tool, connecting things together, using the CIDOC CRM ontology, using their own terminology, and building out and expanding the system. And once that's done, these things automatically become part of the search system. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here that what we call a knowledge map, a visual modeling tool, then becomes part of the database. And you can see here that this is looking at events that contributed to social influence, that influenced the artist Doc Frash, and he was working in the Depression time, and these are sort of influences that were had on his printing works. And this data can come directly from the system into new interfaces. So this is an example of another project done called Late Hokusai, where the researcher was building up data related to the Great Picture Book of Everything. And then the exact same data that was being produced for that research is then reused directly into an interface that allows people to see the results of that research, but in a more curated way that works around the exhibition that was also put in place. And that's the end of my presentation, so thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Well, Dominic, you have achieved something important for the first time today. This room has full house. There are actually people here. So
I'd be delighted because I can't see a thing.
Thank you very much for that. I'm happy. We don't have any questions in workshop, but since you're all here and you came to listen to Dominic, I would expect somebody has some questions. Yes, Axel, you need a microphone.
This is a provocatory question, just to get things right for me. Well, you can never be sure. You said vocabularies are now replaced in being referenced to by knowledge bases. Could you explain on that? Vocabularies are becoming superfluous? That's the provocatory question?
No, I didn't want to be too provocative. So vocabularies are still important. So the way that we look at this is because we're using CIDOC CRM. CIDOC CRM ontology was designed for integration that didn't rely on vocabularies. And the reason for that is that different organizations have different vocabularies. They come from their own traditions, their own cultural histories of those museums have built up their own vocabularies. And they're important in their own right. But in the CIDOC CRM world, we don't try and synthesize them into one. We maybe connect them, but we're connecting through context. So in research-based systems, the more norm would be that you delve down into the ontology, and then you're able to see the differences in the way in which vocabulary is used when you're integrating data. So vocabularies are important, but they're less so as an integration tool, but more so as a way of looking at the history of the way in which different museums have collected. I think there's a book that says, different museums use different vocabularies for the same things because they're situated in different places and have different perspectives.
Still make sense to work on vocabularies, or should we just close the map and use what we have with this new approach?
You still need to use vocabularies.
Sorry?
Use it.
You still need to use vocabularies, but what I'm saying is that they're less important as and they shouldn't be used as an integration tool because it means that that people try to synthesize them together, and you lose the goodness of some of those vocabularies.
Okay.
There is another question here. Yes.
Hi. Sorry if you already said this, but when did you first initially implement ResearchSpace? And I'm curious how long it took to build the influence network that allowed you to actually see the relationships between the information.
So when we first implemented, ResearchSpace has been used by organizations for some time now. And it's been used on various projects, although the sort of the version of ResearchSpace that we have now is sort of is more developed. So doing software development is sort of an ongoing thing. But what I would say is that about 6 years of research went into the system before it was actually built as a production system. So a lot of research has gone into understanding cultural heritage research methodologies. A lot of research has gone into understanding the failures of previous projects, and a lot of that work will be coming out, I hope, in the near future about that explains how we got to where we are with the ResearchSpace system.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other? This is your chance. The time is actually ready for the next presentation, but I am sure that this is such a interesting and valuable work that we will listen to this ongoing story next CIDOC conferences for sure. And very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Dominic.
Thank you very much.